I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and share this information with you, and hope that you're able to take some of it back with you and use it when you're talking to people about what it means to be human and how we all start off. And I've been able to share this information with a lot of different people now. Not only legislators, but students, medical students, college students, and groups like this. And a lot of times my audience is not religious at all, and they're more like the Bill Nye people. So I'm constantly struggling with how to put the words together right so that I can explain it to anybody who wants to know. This is one of my favorite quotes, and this was from Elizabeth Rundle Charles. She was commenting on Martin Luther's confrontation of the key issues in his day. And it is the truth that is assailed in any age which tests our fidelity. If I profess with the loudest voice in the clearest exposition every portion of the truth of God, except precisely that little point that the world and the devil are at that moment attacking, I am not confessing Christ, however boldly I may be professing Christianity. Where the battle rages, the loyalty of the soldier is proved, and to be steady on all the battlefield besides is mere flight and disgrace to him if he flinches at that one point. And that speaks to me very profoundly, because I'm chicken, and when I don't like getting in front of legislators, they can be scary, and some people are not nice, and I've had to face mobs, really. The first time it was like the second time I testified, the crowd in the hearing room was absolutely out of control and screaming, and so I had to really learn to trust God in everything, including just the soundness of the science that he reveals to us. So the main question that we ask is, will it hurt, right? This is a 14-week-old baby, and the most common way of aborting a child at this age is by dismemberment. So the concept of pain perception is very important. It is the responsibility of a civil society to protect human life. Most people would not condone torture and dismemberment in any other circumstance. So we need to convince people to look at the science, to look at the reality of what they're dealing with. It's not a clump of disorganized cells. It's a human being being torn apart. So what I do is I go back to the basics and present some basic concepts to people so they can understand, so you can kind of clear the cobwebs and you don't leave any misunderstandings about what we're dealing with. First of all, there's no evidence, there never has been any evidence of a non-human phase of development, period. It's uniquely human from the beginning. Pain perception is directly correlated to tissue damage. So that's an important thing to understand. It's not just a psychological concept. The development of the structures in the human body early on are directly, or they're simultaneous with the function. So when you have structures appear, they're not non-functional. They're functioning at the very moment that they appear, that we can see them appear. And the perception of pain occurs in the lower brain centers, not in the cortex. And so the reason I put these things out there and I looked at all of these things for one reason is that there's medical literature that tries to point us in a different direction. And so there are errors that are propagated over and over again to the point where nobody challenges it. Even people who want to support life will try to use bad data and work their way around it. So that's why I went back to the basics. I said, let's look at basic science. What can we see with our eyes? What have we been able to discern with science and the study of what's there? And let the embryo give us the evidence, not us project onto the embryo. Okay? So just real quick, Ernst Haeckel was one of the first people who brought up the idea that the human being evolves as it's developing in those first 8 weeks, that it goes through non-human phases. And it was all fraudulent. He admitted it later, but by the time he admitted it, all that information had just been rooted into what was called science, and it remains. Even today, I can find books that will repeat this information as if it's real, even though it was proven fraudulent from the very beginning. But it served somebody's purpose. And this is one of the reasons I think that we come to these erroneous conclusions. This is just the first 8 weeks of a human being's life, right? You're looking starting at 28 days, so 4 weeks of development. And as you look at the changes, which I want you to kind of pay attention if you can see, look how much change happens in just a few days. Look how much change is going on. I mean, this little soul just rapidly putting on flesh. It's forming in a rapid pace. It's remarkable. But when you look at these pictures, they're kind of two-dimensional, they're stale, they're not moving, there's no life there. And so I think it helps our misconceptions sometimes. And we see things that maybe look like a tail. It's not a tail. Just because it looks like it doesn't mean that it's a tail. We just are limited in our ability to understand, and we have to study that so we understand what we're really looking at in these early phases. Well, Eric Blechschmidt is one of the scientists that I really admire. He did 40 years of work in Germany, and he studied over 200,000 serial sections of human embryos and looked at the earliest phases of development to study what's going on in that early time. And he did so many of them, he was able to develop a biodynamic theory of how it develops because he was taking so many serial sections of every phase. He could see the motion. You could see the motion when you put it together. And that was very important for him to be able to see that and develop that understanding for us so that it doesn't look like a static multiplication of cells. He gave us a lot better understanding of the motion and the life that's going on in those early stages. Again, the human being develops from a uniquely human cell from the beginning, day one. And we know that there are no intermediate non-human phases that somehow become human at any point. Okay, that's got to be clearly understood. There's no evidence of anything else. And it's also very important for us to understand, again, structure and function come together. The structures actually are functioning as they develop, and you can see this when you study the development of the embryo. So, for example, when you're looking at the development of a kidney in the earlier weeks, the cells start to congregate and cluster, and they secrete fluid in the middle. So they're all fluid pools forming in the middle. And when the fluid pool gets to a certain size, it exerts pressure, and the cells start to move away from the fluid, and they form a lumen. And that kidney's made up of all these lumens. And it's almost like a little dance, right? You're seeing these cells cluster together, and then they're moving out, and they're making a circle, and they're lining up. It's a very beautiful thing. And it shows us that the cells were functioning as kidney cells before they were really even taking shape into a kidney. So it's functioning at the time that it forms and the time that we can see it. Another thing that we need to be clear about is definition of pain. And when you're looking at medical literature, these definitions will determine the outcome of your study. So if we define pain as a psychological phenomenon, then can we really study pain in an unborn child? Most likely it will be impossible. So if you stick with that definition, then you're really in trouble from the very beginning. You can't really make any statement at all about what that child experiences, because we can't study it. We can't do a little survey and study the outcomes and how did it go. Nothing like that's going to happen. So when you look at basic science, however, now we can have a definition of pain that we can work with and we can actually measure. And that is that it's a protective mechanism. And this is in Guyton, Guyton's a physiology book, and all the medical students study Guyton. It's been the gold standard forever. It's a protective mechanism for the body. It occurs whenever any tissue is being damaged, and it causes the individual to react and remove the pain stimulus. Very objective, very clear, and it can be studied scientifically. And so we classify pain by the fibers. There's the rapid fibers that travel quickly, the type A, and that gives us the pricking pain that we feel, and it's highly localized because of where some of the fibers will end up in the brain. And then we have burning and aching pain, not very well localized. They're the slower pain fibers. However, those pain fibers, because of the way they terminate, they also can summate, and they are responsible for the most intense human suffering. So how do we measure pain perception? The easiest way to do it is take a heating tool and heat the skin until the person says they feel it. They feel the pain. And almost universally, every person will feel pain at about 45 degrees Celsius or 113 degrees Fahrenheit. And why do they start feeling pain at that point? Everyone will report the same thing at the same degree. It's because at that time, cell damage occurs. So it's very logical. You start to feel pain when cell damage occurs. That's when the signals go out, right? Something's going on. The body's being alerted to damage that's occurring, and you begin to respond. And the response is variable as you get older, right? Some people can take it. They're football players or whatever. They charge back into the painful circumstances. And some people are like soccer players, and they fake it, and it's not really even there at all, right? So, but, pain is very predictable. When you have cell damage, you're going to feel it. But how you respond is variable, and it's changed. It depends on your life experiences. But it's very pure in a child who's never experienced all of the same things that we have. They haven't been trained to respond a certain way. They feel it and they respond. It's very automatic. So pain is directly correlated to tissue damage. That's very easy. It's very scientific, and you can demonstrate this. The pain threshold, or the time that we feel pain, is very different than the pain response. The pain response is more learned, and it can change over time. So one of the things that I want to talk about is the subcortical pain pathways, because in the journals that are produced like JAMA and the Royal College of OB-GYN in Great Britain, these scientific studies are saying that pain perception occurs in the cortex, which is the part of your brain where really all our memory and our coordinated, all our learning, speech, and everything, it occurs in this outer area here. Do I have a, see that there, right there, that cortex. So they're saying that's where pain perception occurs, and they have little diagrams, and they arrows pointing here, here's where pain perception is. The problem is there's no evidence that there's a pain perception center in the cortex. In fact, all of the evidence that we have now points to these lower areas here. This is where pain perception occurs. It's in the lower brain centers. It's called the reticular activating center. 99% of many of the fibers, especially the burning, aching pain fibers, they all terminate here in the lower centers. So why is that important? Well, now you really can't say that someone has to have a cortex, like a child with hydranencephaly, in order to feel pain. So even if they have no cortex, or someone might want to define them as having no brain, they still can feel pain because they still have everything in place that's necessary for a pain response. It's an important thing for us to remember, And when we think about what we're saying when we call little babies brain dead and the way they get treated, it should make us stop and think. So reticular activating system is where all the pain fibers terminate. There are a few pain fibers, and a very few, it's like like a tenth or less, that are type A only. So that's the fast-picking pain fibers that will connect in the thalamus and then have another fiber going into the cortex, to the somatosensory part of the cortex. And the reason it goes there is to localize the pain. That's why you can identify where a pinprick is a lot better than you can any kind of a backache or other types of burning pain that we might experience. Because there are a few fibers, and not a lot, but they're very good at localizing the pain. Okay? So,
Can I ask a quick question, Doctor?
Sure.
So what you're saying is our brain, we are feeling the pain before we actually know where it is.
Your cells, yeah, well, it's so quick, though. Those fast fibers are so quick.
Right.
The time lapse, I'm not even sure what it is. But
since the lower parts of the brain are feeling the pain before our cortex is processing where the pain is coming from.
technically, yes, there would be, I don't know what the time difference would be, but you've got a connection. It's going to be short, but there's a connection from the thalamus to the cortex that localizes the pain. But you feel that pain, and you're responding. That reticular activating system causes anxiety, it causes fear, and it makes you respond. You're going to move away from the pain. That's your natural reaction. You have to train that out of someone. This is just a diagram of spinal cord and the pain fiber in green going up. There's that arrow to the part of the cortex where the journal articles will say, here's pain perception. There's no evidence of that. It's actually not true based on all the evidence we have, but it gets repeated over and over and over again. And here's the journal article. I kind of tried to draw it out for you, but they've got pain perception labeled right here. And it gets repeated over and over again. Nobody challenges it. I went through a lot of studies, and most of them will agree on this kind of timeline for development of the embryo in the neurological system. So starting at 7 weeks, you can see the nociceptors, which is the pain cells, right? The pain perception on the hands or the skin, okay, the nociceptors where they detect the pain. And they continue to develop throughout the life of the embryo, really, because they're growing and changing, so they get more and more and more of them. And in fact, in the skin of a little baby, you have more nociceptors than you do when you're an adult. It's very dense and concentrated, so they're actually more sensitive and more able to feel pain than you are. So think about that. Cerebral cortex is there at 8 weeks. It's there early, and it's been developing for a long time, but we can call it a cortex at that point. This point right here, this 26 weeks, this is in the literature, and they use this as your cutoff for pain perception, because what they're saying is that if you don't have a connection between the thalamus and the cortex, because they've defined pain perception as being in the cortex, then you don't feel pain. So they want, some of the journals actually put you at 26 weeks and saying that less than that, babies don't feel pain. We know that's not true. I mean, all the surgeons who do those beautiful surgeries on little babies, they do them way before 20 weeks. I mean, before 26 weeks. And they are trying to anesthetize. They see that they're responding to the instruments and the touch and any kind of invasive procedure that would damage tissue. They can tell it hurts the baby. That's why they use the anesthetic. But for the purpose of defending abortion, this is a useful piece of information that's not really even based on the truth. For one thing, in the development of the brain, you don't have disconnected parts that join together. It develops as a whole. It's never unconnected. it's developing as a whole, and it just becomes more elaborate, and the pathways become well-worn over time, but it's not ever pieced together. So your body develops as a whole from the beginning, from the first cell. Okay, and consciousness is also important. Does not require a cerebral cortex. It's a function of the lower brain centers, so something else to remember. And we see that in the hydroencephalic babies. They may not have a cortex, but they recognize people, they have music preferences, and they feel pain, and they show it. So I was just going to go over a few arguments that I found in the medical articles that argue against the concept of fetal pain. They're defending the abortion industry, basically, and you can see it in the way they discuss this. First of all, they say there's not enough evidence. And again, lack of evidence that effectiveness of direct fetal anesthesia is there. So I'm not sure what evidence they're looking for, but if you have a little unborn baby at 20 weeks that's thrashing wildly around it being touched by a surgical instrument, and you're going to say, well, that's no evidence that they feel pain, and giving them anesthetic, you just stop them from moving. But this is the argument that's there in the literature. Okay, they're saying there's no evidence. Well, yeah, but I can't prove that you feel pain either. I can do a survey on you, I can ask you, I can see that you're responding. I still can't prove it. I can't prove that the baby feels pain either if you're going to look at it that way, but I can show they have an intact nervous system, and I can show that they're capable of having tissue damage, and we know that those two things are required for pain perception. Same thing that you have, okay? So, limited data on the safety of the woman in the context of abortion. So since we've never tried to protect the baby from pain in the context of abortion, we don't have data. So since we don't have data, we shouldn't try it, is their argument. And then they're saying that the techniques used in surgery don't apply in the context of abortion because they cite fetal beneficence. So what they're saying is that because when you're trying to heal a child in the womb using surgical techniques, you're trying to help the baby, but in the context of abortion, you're not. Therefore, you really can't compare the two. And this is the exact quote, just in case it's really there in the literature. In the context of abortion, fetal analgesia would be used solely for the beneficence toward the fetus, assuming fetal pain exists. Instead, further research should focus on when pain-related thalamocortical pathways become functional in humans. And we've already shown that that's not even necessary, but you need to have a rabbit trail if you're going to stay away from the truth. And so it's a great way to direct people's research, because you can study that forever and you'll never come up with the answer. So when all of the research that's out there now and that continues to be added to the research and to the data, it confirms again and again and again, it affirms that there is plenty of evidence that an unborn child feels pain. And in fact, if you look at the data, the time that a little baby is capable of feeling pain, the time when all of the elements are there that are functioning, is 7.5 weeks. 7.5 weeks, you've already got an intact pain perception system, and you have cells that can be damaged. The problem that we have is we think, okay, 7.5 weeks, we're looking at somewhere here on the end, here, and people are thinking, I don't think that sounds, maybe in here, you're starting to see that 7.5. We can't relate, right? And to some people, it's like a non-issue. And that's our limited ability to understand. That doesn't change the truth that they have an intact pain perception system. But we're limited in our ability to relate to a baby that small and what kind of pain they might experience. This is 9 weeks. It was a miscarriage. But look at how human and frail that looks. I mean, nobody looks at that and thinks anything but it's a human being. And there's a lot of little babies aborted at that age. So what I want to leave you with is kind of a picture of what's going on in those first 8 weeks. It's at that time when we really have a hard time relating to this human being forming. And there are a lot of biodynamics that we miss because of the static pictures that we see and we look at over and over again. So first of all, you get that flash of light. You've heard about that right at the moment of conception. There's a flash of light, which is really cool, and that was recently been noted, and they've been able to take pictures of it, which is a neat kind of ta-da. To me, it's exciting, right? And it's a signal that life is beginning. As soon as that egg is fertilized, the metabolic fields that are set into motion, it's like a symphony. There's materials moving into the cell, and it's changing rapidly. There's organization within that cell, that one cell that's lining up, and it's gearing up for action. So it's absorbing nutrients as fast as possible and beginning to divide and develop more cells within itself, and it's staying as a whole. Okay, remember, these aren't little cells that you can pick apart like a batch of yeast, like so many people think. It's not like that. It is organizing within a membrane, an outer cell, okay, the outer membrane, and then it develops as the cells multiply and become more and more numerous. They really start to organize into layers, and they secrete fluid, and sometimes fluid will pool between layers of cells, and that puts pressure on them and causes them to adapt and change. So what we think of as like a DNA-driven multiplication isn't like that at all. It's very interactive. There's a lot of external forces acting on that little developing embryo that we don't think about. There's fluid pressure, and there's stretching and pulling, and there's motion, and I can't tell you where that motion is coming from, but a lot of that motion is shaping this human being. Some of the motion is created by the differential rate of growth of different layers of cells. So when you imagine this little baby forming, and you have the cell layers lining up, and they're growing and growing and changing, they start to bend and shape because one layer will slow down its growth rate and the other speeds up, and it starts to pile up and shape and bend and turn and twist. So you have all this motion going on very early. The nutritional materials that are moving in, they actually organize into pathways. And around those pathways, cells start to line up, and you have your arteries and your capillaries. When the baby gets to where you start to see the limbs, what's really beautiful is, first of all, the arteries and the veins that are developing in the limbs are pulled into it. It's like clay in a potter's hand. It's being pulled into the limbs. And when the skeletal components of the hand are growing, there's no ligaments, there's no joints yet. And as those components are growing, they outpace the fascia. So the little hand is starting to move because the pull from the fascia on the front side is making the fingers bend as the skeletal part's growing, right? Does that make sense? And when it starts to speed up its pace on this side slows down, and so the little hand is moving back and forth like this as it's growing. So that motion creates your ligament. So once the motion has been in place for a while, you get a fluid line that provides the basis for the cells to wrap around, and you get your ligament. And in the places where you have a bend, you get a joint forming. So the joint wasn't there to begin with. So you see what I'm saying? The motion is creating the child. And as they get older, like at 10 weeks, you have little facial expressions starting to show up, and they're very awkward at first. And they repeat them over and over again. It's like they're practicing, right? And they get more and more organized and more beautiful as time goes on. And their arms start to flow more, and it's not as jerky. The movement of breathing starts at 10 weeks that we can see. we see the little rib cage starting to move in and out. They're breathing at 10 weeks. And it's not air, we know that. But that motion is shaping their lungs. It's shaping the rib cage. It's training the muscles. It's necessary. So this motion is shaping and creating this child. And the little babies will do things like, look like they're running, they're moving their arms, they're waving sometimes, right? When you see the sonogram, you see the wave, and you think how cute that is. All these little facial expressions, all the things that we think of as human, yawning, blinking, smiling, grimacing, you know, it's all being formed and practiced and coached while they're in there. And that's what shapes your brain. So that gives your brain its pathways, that motion creating the brain and forming it. It's not the brain forming first, assembling together, and then you have motion like a little toy being turned on with electricity. It's not like that at all. Did you have a question? That's a great question, and I haven't studied what other people have looked at with the animals. I don't know, like if you were looking at a duck or a bird, if you could really see the smile like that. So maybe some, but you know, I couldn't tell you the answer, and I don't know if it's been studied this way. This is uniquely human, and so what I'm looking at is the human development, and that's what Dr. Blechschmidt, and the reason he wanted to stick with human development is because so many people intertwine, and they try to take a pig embryo and use that evidence to define human development. It's really not a good way to study human development. So yeah, that's a great question, but I don't have the answer. If there's the same kind of thing, who knows, you know? So the point is, we've got an interactive environment where there's motion, there's life, there's movement, and that movement shapes your brain. That movement is what makes you who you are. And it's so much more beautiful in so many ways than what people describe. And I like some of these pictures, like this one, because you can almost see that motion in it. It looks like it's floating. And if it was moving little, you know, limbs, you can see that in this. And I like this one, too. It just shows the majesty, the beauty of the human being being formed. And so, like I said, I've testified a lot. I've heard a lot of women testify about abortion and viciously defend it. You know, a lot of times they're very angry. I've heard the hearts cry of these women. I know they're hurting, and I know a lot of them are bitter and angry. And so I'm not passing judgment on anybody. You know, what I want to do is show you the science. And remember, science cannot tell us that it's right or wrong to kill someone. You can never take that from science. We have to have a higher moral law that we adhere to, because science and human law can shift with the will of the man. And so when I hear the women testifying, I hear them defending the right to abort, I can tell that they believe what they're doing is right. They believe that. And so I like this quote from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who survived the communist gulags, all the murder. And he said, to do evil, a human being must first of all believe that what he's doing is good. So it's just a different perspective. And having heard so many people, including pastors, I've heard pastors defend abortion. It just helps when you realize that nobody wants to be seen as evil, but they do believe that they're defending something good, even if in their heart they might know it's not. So, if you have any questions, I'm glad to answer them.
I spoke to you earlier this morning about old organ donors and all those brain stuff that politics got now. And what I mentioned to you about the article I read, organ donors are still alive while their organs are being harvested. Is this true?
This is true as far as I know. I don't know, and I've not really looked at all of the data related to that practice. And I do know, like I've told you, I know heart surgeons that do transplants, but there is this discussion on that really you are taking one life to save another.
And in fact, then they aren't completely dead, and they are in fact feeling pain during the course of these organ collections.
I think it's possible
That's something.
because we wouldn't know.
As that is studied further, that's something that Mr. Light also should keep in mind as far as should we condone organ donation or should we not condone organ donation. And I suppose, that could be an ethical question as far as the family is concerned. If you left up to the family to decide that sort of thing, I agree. But still, they should have that knowledge of what's actually taking place to their loved one as those organs are being harvested.
Yeah, I think that's it's a topic we really do need to look at more. And I have not put a lot of time into researching it. So I know other people have, and some people are very strongly against organ donation for that reason. So I was trained traditional, like all the other doctors. I mean, you have to kind of part ways at some point to think on your own and think about the ethics of things, because in medical school they teach us that abortion saves lives. So, Any other questions? Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.